"You're being let go, Karen, effective immediately. Tina will take over your duties." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. Just 20 minutes ago, I was wrapping up Tina's final training session. Now she was my replacement. Mr. Dalton didn't flinch. No apology, no explanation. Just those words tossed out like old paper. I stood there, still holding her training report. My name neatly typed at the bottom. 12 years gone. What hit hardest wasn't the job. It was how easily they discarded me. The way he chuckled, calling me old school Karen, like it was some kind of inside joke. Outside his office, Tina sat confidently at my desk, pretending to be surprised. But she wasn't. She knew. "My name is Karen Miles. I'm 58. For over a decade, I kept this company's biggest projects alive, navigating red tape, securing permits, solving problems no one else could. And today they fired me without a second thought. But I'm not here to complain. I'm here to show you what happens when they underestimate the wrong woman. This story will make you angry, inspired, and maybe a little shocked by the ending. So before we dive in, grab a cup of tea, turn up the volume, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. At first, I thought Tina was just another intern, eager, uncertain, and maybe a little too into her phone. She asked a lot of questions, took notes like a college student cramming for finals, and always showed up early, flashing that bright, toothy smile. I didn't mind. I liked mentoring. I'd seen fresh graduates blossom into capable professionals before, and I genuinely believed she could be one of them. She'd often linger after meetings, asking about things beyond the basics. How do you get the city to process permits faster? Or why do you always call Sheila at zoning on Tuesdays? I took her under my wing, shared my shortcuts, introduced her to contacts I'd built over decades. I even invited her to a dinner event with the local development board. She was nervous, but she shined that night. I felt proud, like I was passing the torch. Looking back now, it wasn't pride. It was blind trust. There were whispers, of course. One of my coworkers, Jenna, once said, "Karen, you're too generous with your tricks. Some people play a longer game." I laughed it off. I didn't believe Tina had it in her to be anything other than sincere. But then, I started to notice small things. Tina had meetings with Mr. Dalton, and I wasn't invited. She suddenly had opinions in strategy sessions, echoing ideas I'd only ever shared with her. And then there were the lunches. One day I walked into the cafe down the block and saw them, at a corner table, leaning in close, laughing. My stomach sank. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he just saw promise in her. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was projecting. So I pushed the doubts down and kept mentoring. But every now and then, I'd catch that flicker in her eyes. Calculating. Like she already knew how this would end. The day I was fired, everything clicked into place. Tina hadn't just positioned herself as my successor, she became the future the company wanted. Young, connected, tech-savvy, easy to mold. And I had handed her the blueprint. But what she didn't know was that I'd built the foundation too, and that foundation didn't belong to Everline or to her. I didn't say goodbye to Tina that day. I just walked past her desk and out the door. But in my mind, I was already outlining what came next. If they thought I was finished, they hadn't looked closely enough at what I left behind, and they were about to find out. I spent the weekend in a daze replaying every conversation, every small moment with Tina that now felt so different in hindsight. But come Monday morning, the fog started to lift. I wasn't just hurt, I was offended, deeply, because it wasn't just that they fired me, it was how easily they did it. As if my 12 years of work didn't carry any weight at all. I joined Everline during a rough patch back when the firm was still just a modest outfit, with big dreams and too many zoning issues. I didn't walk in with flashy degrees or viral posts. I brought something else: results. I knew which permits to file, when who to call at the city when approvals got stuck, and how to navigate the impossible maze of regulations that made or broke every development in Chicago. Back then, Mr. Dalton had told me, You're our secret weapon. That's why he trusted me with Lakefront Towers, the most ambitious project we'd ever touched. A massive redevelopment of the lakeshore backed by investors with deep pockets and zero patience for red tape. I'd been working behind the scenes for months to clear the way. And here's what no one in that glossy office seemed to remember. Lakefront's permits weren't just pending. They were intricate, delicate, tied to years of relationships and handshake deals that only I could call in. That wasn't ego, that was fact. But they'd written me off like some outdated software, nice to have, not necessary to keep. So I opened my laptop and pulled up my files. All of them. Every document, every permit application I'd carefully logged and stored. I'd been meticulous for years, mostly out of habit. But now that habit had become my leverage. As I scrolled through the folders labeled Lakefront, I saw something that even Tina, with all her ambition and charm, could never replicate. The final approval request. Still unsigned, still tied to my name. I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of it settle. If they thought this project could continue without me, they were about to get a very expensive wake-up call. And I wasn't going to raise my voice. I was going to raise the stakes. The funny thing is, I never meant to set up a backup plan. Back in 2017, the city's planning department was drowning in backlog. Harold, one of the senior permit officers I'd worked with for over 20 years, pulled me aside after a zoning board meeting. Karen, he said, we need someone who understands how this process works, someone developers trust, and the city can rely on. That conversation became the seed for something bigger. I registered a small consulting firm, just a shell at first, Miles Permitting Services, LLC. Nothing flashy, just a legal entity that let me act as a liaison between developers and the city. Everline knew about it. Dalton even encouraged it. If it helps move things along, I'm all for it, he'd said back then, sipping his overpriced espresso. And it did help. Massively. By keeping the approval funnel clean and predictable, we managed to expedite project approvals twice as fast. But what everyone seemed to forget, including Dalton himself, was the Lakefront Towers permits. They'd been filed entirely through my LLC. My signature wasn't just a formality. It was a requirement. The applications were filed under a joint model where Miles Permitting acted as the official regulatory representative of record. So when I stared at the unsigned final clearances in my cloud drive, I realized something even more powerful. Everline couldn't move forward without me. Not legally. Not procedurally. Not unless they wanted to start from scratch with months of delays and a serious hit to investor confidence. I printed the documents, slid them into a folder, and made myself a fresh cup of tea. For the first time since I walked out of that office, I didn't feel small or discarded. I felt calm, because I had something they couldn't replicate with youth or hashtags. And the best part, they had no idea. Tina probably thought all that paperwork had magically landed on her desk. Dalton likely assumed the city would wave things through. But Harold and his team, they followed protocol. And protocol meant they needed me. As I sat down to draft a letter, I smiled, thinking about how tomorrow's phone calls might sound. Because when your name is still the key to the door they're trying to walk through, silence becomes a very compelling message. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept circling one question. Should I let it go? Or should I remind them politely why replacing me so easily was a mistake? Plan A had always been respect. I'd built my career on it. Quiet professionalism. Integrity. Getting the job done without drama. But when you're pushed out without warning, when your experience is dismissed with a laugh and a wave, sometimes Plan B starts to look like the only language they understand. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I called Victoria, my oldest friend and a sharp employment attorney with a dry sense of humor and a nose for corporate nonsense. So let me get this straight, she said after I laid everything out. They fired you, forgot that your company holds the keys to their biggest project, and now expect those keys to turn on their own. In a nutshell, I replied. Well then, she said, leaning back. Let's put a price on the favor they never earned. We met later that morning at a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. I showed her the permit files, the LLC documents, the city's procedural agreement, all of it. She nodded slowly with a deliberate smile. "You're under no obligation to move a finger unless compensated," she said. "And frankly, if they thought otherwise, that's on them." We drafted a letter. It was professional, polite, airtight. Miles Permitting Services LLC would be happy to finalize the permit process for a consulting fee of $80,000 equivalent to the salary I would have earned over the next 9 months. Additionally, I would be formally credited as a regulatory consultant on all project documentation, not just a signature recognition. I sent the letter before lunch. By 4 p.m., I had my first response. An email from Dalton. Short, curt, dismissive. "We'll find another way." I almost laughed. Find another way? With what knowledge? With what access? That night I didn't recheck my inbox. I watered my garden, called my daughter, and let the silence stretch a little longer. Because sometimes the best negotiation begins with no reply. And the next morning, the real surprise came, not from Everline, but from someone I never expected to hear from. Someone with far more power than Dalton could ever pretend to have. The phone rang just after 9. I didn't recognize the number, and for a second I almost let it go to voicemail. But something in my gut nudged me. I picked up. "Mrs. Miles, this is Leonard Bright." My breath caught. I'd heard the name 100 times. Leonard Bright, real estate mogul, the principal investor behind the Lakefront Towers project, and not exactly known for casual calls. His voice was calm, but direct, no wasted words. "I understand there's been a complication regarding the permitting process," he said. "Mr. Dalton hasn't been entirely clear. I'd appreciate hearing it from you." 20 minutes later, we had a meeting scheduled for the next morning at his downtown office. I barely slept that night, not from nerves, but from anticipation. Leonard Bright didn't waste time with pleasantries. And he certainly didn't call middle managers unless something had gone very wrong. His office was sleek. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Minimalist decor, the kind of silence that makes every word matter. He greeted me with a firm handshake. Coffee was already waiting. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. From the beginning. I showed him my files, LLC filings, procedural agreements, with the city the full permit trail. I walked him through the timeline. Every document with my name. Every step Everline had conveniently ignored. He didn't interrupt. He listened closely. Studied the paperwork like a man reviewing battle maps. When I finished, he leaned back, hands steepled under his chin. "So, without your sign-off, this project stalls?" "It already has," I said quietly. And Dalton knew this. I nodded. He just didn't think I'd use it. Leonard didn't smile, but his eyes sharpened. "Mrs. Miles, I'd like to make you an offer, one that bypasses Everline entirely. I want to retain your firm directly, same fee, plus a performance bonus. You'd work with my team, not theirs." I kept my face neutral, but inside, I felt the tide turning. "And Everline?" I asked. "That's for me to handle," he said, voice cool. "But let's just say I no longer tolerate mismanagement." As I walked out with a handshake agreement and the promise of a formal contract, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Dalton. "Emergency meeting. 3 p.m. today. We need to talk." I didn't respond, because when the investor calls you directly, you're not the backup plan, you're the new foundation. By the time I got home from the meeting with Leonard Bright, the messages had already started flooding in. 3 missed calls from Dalton, 2 emails marked urgent, 1 voicemail that began with, "Look, Karen, I think there's been a misunderstanding," and ended with, "Please call me back. We need to resolve this." I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat out on the back porch. The spring air was cool, the garden quiet. It felt good to hear birds, not the buzz of a boardroom. Then came the one message I hadn't expected. It was from Tina. Subject line, "Please help." The body was half apology, half guilt trip. She claimed she didn't know I'd be let go, that things had spiraled out of her control. She said she respected me, that she only wanted the project to succeed. And then came the ask, softened by flattery. We'd be grateful if you could just sign off. I'd even make sure your name is in the acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. After 12 years of building that firm's backbone, I deleted the email without a second thought. Leonard's contract came through that afternoon. It was better than I expected: fair pay, performance bonuses, and full credit as regulatory lead. I sent it to Victoria for review, and within hours we had a signed agreement. The next morning, while I was at the nursery picking out new tomato seedlings, Dalton texted again. Name your price. The consultation fee was approved. Let's talk. Too late. Because Leonard wasn't just hiring me for lakefront towers. He was considering dropping Everline altogether. And if that happened, the fallout would be far bigger than a few permits. That afternoon, I planted my seedlings in the warm, moist soil, taking my time. There was something grounding in the act. Simple, honest. Each seed has its purpose. Each one grows at its own pace. Just like the plan I hadn't meant to plant. That evening, I got a call from someone unexpected, someone whose name carried even more weight than Dalton's, a name I hadn't heard in years, but one I knew would change everything, not just for me, but for the entire game. The unexpected call came from Naomi Hughes, a senior executive at Metro Core Group, another major investor in lakefront towers, and several other projects across the city. She'd heard about the shakeup, the permitting delay, and about my new role. But more than that, she'd heard I was the one holding it all together now. We met over lunch the next day. She didn't waste time. Karen, people are watching, she said. You said no to a company that underestimated you, and now they're unraveling. That matters. What surprised me most was how many people were quietly rooting for me. I'd always assumed no one really noticed the behind-the-scenes work, the late-night emails, the favor calls to city planners, the quiet approvals that kept the gears turning. But apparently, they'd seen more than I thought. Word traveled fast. By Thursday, I'd received inquiries from 2 other firms. One even offered to bring me on as a regulatory consultant for their entire Midwest portfolio. Meanwhile, Everline was in free fall. An old colleague told me they'd just lost another client. Investors were nervous. And Tina, she'd been reassigned to social media strategy. Apparently, she submitted a variance request without the supporting documentation and nearly stalled another project. Saying no hadn't burned a bridge. It revealed who'd been holding it up in the first place. I used that momentum to start something new. I hired 2 women I'd worked with before, both in their 50s, both sharp, both quietly pushed aside when younger faces arrived. We started small, taking on compliance cases too complex or too time-sensitive for the big firms to handle. And yes, I began mentoring again. But this time it was on my terms, with people who valued learning over ladder climbing. By the end of the month, Miles Permitting Services wasn't just a one-woman operation anymore. It was a team. A growing, resilient team with experience as its foundation. And while I was building that, I hadn't given Everline a second thought until Harold from the city called. "You'll want to hear this," he said, his voice laced with something between amusement and disbelief. And what he told me next. That's when I realized just how far the ripple had reached, and how quickly karma moves. When the right threads are pulled, Harold didn't usually call twice in one day. But when he did, I knew something big had happened. "Karen," he said, barely hiding his amusement. "Dalton just tried to bypass your LLC by filing a new set of permits completely outside the expedited system we built." I raised an eyebrow. "How'd that go?" "He claimed the dinosaur procedures need updating," Harold said. "The director reminded him those dinosaurs are the only reason his firm got fast-track access in the first place." I chuckled. not out of malice, but at the predictability of it all. When people ignore the system that lifted them, they usually fall harder than they expect. That afternoon, Leonard invited me to the first official coordination meeting with the new project team. I walked into the same conference room where I'd once sat silently beside Everline's architects. Only this time, everything had shifted. I wasn't the note-taker anymore. I was the lead. Then came the real shock. Leonard announced he was terminating Everline's contract entirely. The mishandling of the permit process shows a lack of judgment I can't afford on a $50 million project, he said flatly. We'll be partnering with Hartman and Associates moving forward. Hartman, Everline's biggest competitor. Better yet, the firm had agreed to use the existing plans with only minor revisions. It was a complete takeover. I asked gently, "What about the intellectual property on those designs? We own them?" Leonard replied, "Per contract. They're ours to transfer." When the meeting ended, I stepped outside. My phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues. One congratulated me. Another said Everline's in chaos. 2 more clients walked out. And Tina's officially gone. Gone, just like that. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just stood there quietly watching the skyline I'd helped shape. Through a decade of behind-the-scenes effort, maybe to some it looked like karma. But to me it was just a consequence. A natural chain of events that unfolds when you treat people like tools, not teammates. As I got in my car, an email from the Omaha Herald popped up. Permit Queen turns the tables on former employer. I smiled, folded the newspaper printout from last week into my purse, and turned the ignition. Tomorrow was the groundbreaking, and the final word in this story. It wouldn't be mine to speak. It would be laid in concrete. The morning of the groundbreaking arrived with a soft golden haze over the lakefront. It was the kind of day Chicago rarely offered: clear, calm, with just enough breeze to rustle the ceremonial banners near the site. I arrived early. Not out of habit, but out of something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or closure. City officials gathered. Investors posed for photographs. The press circled in, eager for a headline. I stayed back until Leonard waved me over. "Karen, come stand here. You're part of this." I took my place, 1 foot in gravel, the other steady in new soil, literally and figuratively. As the cameras clicked and the shovels lifted their first scoop of dirt, I felt something shift. Not just in the ground beneath us, but in me. After the ceremony, a young woman approached. She looked barely out of college, nervous but determined. "Ms. Miles," she said, "I read about you. I'm studying urban development. Could I learn from you?" I smiled, remembering Tina. Remembering myself at that age and all the silent doors I'd had to pry open. Alone. "Of course," I said. "Everyone starts somewhere." That moment stayed with me longer than the applause or the newspaper article that followed. Because what I'd built wasn't just a comeback. It was a foundation. One that others could now stand on. In the weeks that followed, my small firm grew carefully, intentionally. We focused on mentoring mid-career professionals, especially those often overlooked for their age, background, or quiet competence. We didn't chase every project. We chose the ones that mattered. The ones where experience wasn't just welcomed, it was needed. I never set out to bring anyone down. I just refused to be erased. And if there's one thing this chapter taught me, it's this. When people reduce you to a label: too old, too slow, too set in your ways, they're not seeing your story. They're skipping the chapters that made you who you are. So plant your seeds, build your roots. And when the season turns, let them see what blooms. If this story moved you or reminded you of your worth, don't forget to subscribe. Share your thoughts below. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, because stories like these deserve to be heard everywhere.